I know better, but then I just don't act like it. I don't do it. I may have this good intention, wherever it's coming from, maybe because there are convincing studies that sports, meditation, whatever is actually going to be good for me. Or I may come from a personal point of suffering and just know exactly what I need to do or how I need to be in order to end that suffering. I may be, I don't know, tired every morning and know that if I just stopped watching Netflix for 2 hours in the evenings, I would feel better for the entire rest of the day. So why don't I do it? That's not a Buddhist problem, that's a human problem. And by the way, I think all Buddhist problems are actually human problems. But this one is so, for a lot of people, so relatable. There's a study out that about 80%, up to 80% of our New Year's resolutions fail in the first 6 weeks of the new year. So what's going on there? Why is that happening? How come that we can know something and we can know it in a really important way? We know it with real passion in it, or emotion in it, or wish or motivation in it. And yet we just can't get this knowing to translate into either actual experience or action. What is going on? Aren't we defined by what we know? Isn't that who we are? And if it's not, then what are we? Like, where is this gap coming from? And then what can we learn from this gap about how we exist? We can learn a lot, I think, from this gap. For one thing, that mere knowing apparently, just scientifically proven, does not directly translate into changing our behavior. And we can see that not just in our personal lives, but obviously also on a big scale. The ecological catastrophe could be changed, but we just don't do it. We know better. And also systemically, collectively, it's not happening. So if that's really clear, then let's look at what knowing really is. And I think it's actually misleading, and that's the case a lot of the time in all, like, English or German or also French, as far as I know. Oftentimes our languages don't provide enough words for what really needs to be explored here. And the fact that we only have basically one word for knowledge, knowing. Yes, there are variations of that word, but still we kind of think we know knowing. We think we know knowledge, more or less, at least in our daily lives. Even I know that, like, if you're a scholar in that field, you would think about it with a lot more differentiation. But still, on a common sense, there's just, if I say, oh, I know that, then that's an absolute statement. Usually the other person wouldn't come back and ask, well, what exactly do you mean with you know that? What kind of knowing is it? What level of knowing is it? Within the many different possibilities of how something can be known, how do you specifically know that one thing? We don't do that because we assume if a person says, I know this, that that's an absolute statement, but it's not. What I found is that it can really be useful to differentiate between 4, I call it modalities of knowing, 4 ways of knowing. And let me just put in very briefly here a view on mind. This is just one aspect of it, but I think it's helpful to see mind, which of course that's the thing that knows. So to view mind not as a container in which knowing is kind of accumulated the way that books are accumulated in the library, but to view mind as a collecting field, as a collector. Almost like it's a bit of it's an energetically dynamic metaphor that I'm bringing up here. Mind as a collector, as a magnetic field, how mind accumulates, collects knowings, notions, experiences, depending on how mind is activated in a particular situation. We can see how this metaphor works, say, in daily life. When, for instance, if you've ever had that experience, like if you're really stressed, at least that's true for me, if I'm really stressed and my bodily mind is in that state of being stressed, and then I walk down to breakfast and then somebody approaches me with another thing they want me to do, then I'll collect this particular experience from the perspective of stress. Like, stress will almost magnetically attract more stress. The request itself may actually not be stressful. And on another day when I feel better, it wouldn't have caused stress. But now that my mind is in a stressful mode, I'm collecting more stress. I'm pulling almost the potential stress out of just ordinary situations that could either be stressful or not stressful. So, like, mind collects. And this is not just true emotionally, where oftentimes stress collects more stress, anxiety tends to collect or attract more anxiety. But it's also true in a more fundamental way, where mind has just, I think it's good to think of mind as a collecting field of knowing, which has different modalities of knowing. Buddhism is great about making distinctions, and you can make many, many different kinds of distinctions in like how to just create categories within those fields of knowing. I'm just going to create 4. I think that's a simple model. And the first modality of knowing, I'm just going to call examining. And that's our usual understanding of, we examine things through our intellect, say, and I'm using, with how I'm calling them at least, I'm always trying to find verbs for them that describe the activity of that particular modality of knowing. So the examining mind, what it does is it examines intellectually. It looks at, what is this thing? Like, if I want to know more about compassion, I can examine the concept of compassion. How is compassion different from pity? Is it the same as empathy? And so forth. So I can examine the concept. And we're very, very, I think, mostly familiar with that modality of knowing. Now, big news is that is by far not the only way that we know things. We can also know things, obviously, through experience. And experience is not automatically examined. We accumulate experience based on past experience. But once we're experiencing something, we have a feeling for it. So while the modality of examining would answer to the question, what is it? Or at least it would try to answer to the question of, what is it that I'm trying to know? The modality of experiencing would answer to the question, what does it feel like? What's the experience of it? And that's a very different way of knowing something. You know, you can know tons about a banana, but unless you've actually tasted it, you don't really know it from experience. So I think that part is obvious. And so much in contemplative practice is, first of all, about creating that translation from, you may hear a concept, some teaching concept, be anything like change or interdependence. But then the first step you always want to make is, how can I translate the examined knowledge? I've examined interdependence. How can I translate that into experience? What does it feel like? How do I feel differently when I feel interdependent? So that's an experiential, explorative question that can't be answered in the head. It can only be answered within and through experience. It's really important for a practitioner, I think, to realize that even when we've experienced something, there's more. There are more ways of knowing. Experiences oftentimes can just land on the shelf of experiential trophies, so to speak. Oh, I've had that experience. Now I own it. But that's not Zen. Really, from my point of view, starts, or contemplative practice, I think what I want to emphasize, really starts when you're going through the trouble. And it is a bit of a trouble, because now this is the part that takes years, decades. And why in contemplative practice you're not done after a weekend workshop is, once we've had a taste of something, the real path is all about how to translate this experience into embodiment. That is a completely different way of knowing something. An experience is still me, from my current embodiment, looking at the object of that experience. I have that experience. Embodiment is looking from that experience. And that is so fundamentally different. In the example of, say, compassion, I can experience compassion, but when it's embodied, I am compassion. I am compassion. It's not even an object of my experience anymore. It is what I am. Suzuki Roshi says at one point in Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, he says, if something is really true, then there's no need to say so. That has always stayed with me as a kind of worthwhile phrase to ponder upon. And I think, the feeling here is that if something is true, and in this case, true means embodied, or, and that's going to be the fourth, enacted, then it's so clear you are it. You don't need to talk about it. It's just what you are. A compassionate person does not need to keep announcing they're compassionate. It just doesn't even occur to them because it's so first nature. So the translation from experiencing something into embodying it is a gradual process. As I said, it takes decades. What's happening in that process is we're changing, transforming our physiology, and we're starting to emanating that quality that we're embodying. That process is very simply achieved through repetition. And repetition, not the same thing over and over again, but it's, as my teacher Baker Roshi says, it's really important to see it's an iterative process. Like each application of the practice is going to be a new experience. So, but what you keep doing, that's the repetitive part, you keep applying the practice, say, of compassion. You keep bringing your mind towards or into that quality, and you keep exploring how to embody it, to act from it. But every time you do it, you learn something new. And that newness also needs to be acknowledged in the practice of embodiment, in the process of embodiment. In other words, you can't think your way to it, to embodiment. You can only live your way into it. And now here's a little bit bad news for practitioners, because you'd think, geez, once I've embodied something, then I'm finished. Now I'm mastering that teaching. But in my experience, that's really not true. I think it's worthwhile to think of a fourth modality of knowing, which is enactment. And that means I've learned how to translate what I'm embodying, what's being embodied, into actions. And that's actually not trivial. It doesn't even it may be fully embodied, how to enact it, how to act in accord with the intention of the embodiment is not trivial. And the thing we have to do in the process of enacting is we actually have to watch how what we're doing affects our surroundings, how it affects others. In other words, is the intention that's present in the embodiment, are the consequences of my actions really in accord with the intention? And what that means is we have to be open to feedback, because I may be fully, my intention may be entirely compassionate, but in the midst of feeling so compassionate, I may be creating a huge chaos because I'm not doing it skillfully. So enactment, it's hugely about skillful means, what's meant by skillful means in Buddhism. And what that means is the openness and the willingness to learn from the consequences of our actions, to take in feedback, and to learn how to refine our actions. And that also requires, like before, the process was pretty much, we can do it within ourselves, but that last way of knowing something, knowing is the enactment part, is a reciprocal process. The other person or our surroundings deeply participate in creating that fourth way of knowing. And that is so important. That last piece is, if you will, what contemplative practice really is about. It's about living in the midst of this reciprocal field where the so-called other profoundly participates in the process of knowing.